This is Changeling the podcast. Greetings, Changeling fans. Pooka here, and welcome to Changeling the podcast. Come for the glamour, stay for the vibes. I had to remember our intro thing because I am doing this without Josh today, but joining me is guest host and friend of the show, Charles Siegel. Welcome, Charles.
Hey, glad to be here.
So, today, our topic, on which I understand you are an expert, at least more of an expert than I am probably, are video games for inspiration in Changeling the Dreaming. So, that's pretty cool, I guess. We've done a few of these kind of media episodes, and video games was one that we hadn't yet covered, so it seemed like the appropriate time. But yeah, I guess for today, we're going to start with a couple opening questions. What would you say, what would you include in your definition of video game? Because I know it's a very expansive category, but I have my ideas and I'm curious to know what yours would be.
I'm going to go super broad and say any experience intending to elicit emotional responses that is entirely mediated through an interactive electronic medium.
You're blowing my mind with that, but I like it.
Well, I want to exclude Microsoft Word, but that's about it.
Clippy as a video game character we should all love and appreciate more. But yes.
Clippy is a nightmare chimera.
I always liked, remember how you could replace Clippy with like other characters? And there was one that I think was called Scribble, and it was a cat made out of scraps of paper, and it was adorable.
I have a vague recollection of this.
So cute.
I have a stronger recollection of a friend of mine managing to hack in other things.
Oh, early modding for Microsoft. Nice. So yeah, I think for me, like anything electronic with graphics, I would call a video game. And I mean, I grew up, in terms of console games, which is what I think people usually point to, I grew up with an Atari 2600 and nothing else. So I feel like I have to include at least computer games and arcade games because those were like primary outlets for me to experience the genre.
Definitely agree there.
Yeah. And there are other, we can make subdivisions, like, is a browser-based, turn-based game as much of a video game as like a first-person shooter, or is a visual novel?
I'm going to argue both of those are more video games than first-person shooters, but that's my bias against first-person shooters.
I 100% am on board with that bias because I
dislike. My bigger question is that because you required graphics, are you excluding Zork?
All right, so maybe less than graphics, a graphical interface. No, that's the wrong term. A screen of some kind, maybe. I would absolutely include Zork. Zork is life.
So if you played Zork by keyboard and text-to-speech, that's no longer a video game?
See, this is the hair splitting. But... No, but we should be, though, because it is such a large category with so many distinctions within it that like trying to find a unifying theory of what is video game is quite difficult. But I'd say anything... All right, so the trifecta of like immersive, multimodal, and mostly finite, I think, is something that I'm going to hang with as part of my concept. I would also say they have to be recognized as games. So like I wouldn't count Second Life, even though you could probably play video games within Second Life. But in and of itself, I would not call it a video game.
What do you mean by mostly finite?
In the sense that most video games have an end point in mind. Like there is an end to a lot of them. I have more to say of that in my next question that I'm going to ask.
Okay, because I could take issue with that one.
Mostly finite. Not always and not entirely, but my conception of them, which I admit is rooted in like the late 70s, early 80s probably, is that video games have a you win or you lose state more than tabletop role-playing games do. I would also say for the purposes of this episode, we should probably focus on ones that have some kind of storytelling aspect. So like, yes, Tetris and Candy Crush are video games. They're not necessarily relevant as inspirations for Changeling in a robust way. Those are my caveats.
Yeah, one thing worth noting is that the games we're going to discuss are very unambiguously video games. We're not pushing any boundaries here.
We're entering that ludonarrative space that role-playing games occupy.
I guess the last one is the most questionable, but even then, no one questions it.
Yeah. Well, all right. So that I'm going to lead into the second question then. What is it about video games that lend themselves to inspiration for tabletop RPGs? Like, what are the similarities and the differences in your perspective?
Right. So my big thought there is that by their very nature, video games are more constrained than tabletop. Like you said, you focused on some sort of some finiteness, but to me, it's that you only have the options that were actually programmed into the game.
Okay.
Tabletop, you have the option of doing anything you can think of, provided that the GM doesn't tell you, "Don't be an asshole."
Yeah.
So
Ideally.
yeah. So I have found at least that when I spend a lot of time dealing with constraints, I start getting ideas and pushing more for freedom. So like if I go and, play a 60-hour computer RPG, I don't want to just sit down and play another 60-hour computer RPG. I want to go and play some tabletop game where the game is not telling me no, you can't do this constantly.
Hmm. Makes sense. And I think that's when I was saying finiteness, that was part of what I was getting at is that there are usually limits kind of baked into or literally coded into the game for a video game, that is.
Yeah, I think that's a more interesting and useful notion of finiteness than that they end.
Yeah, that's fair. So I'm going to put on my media studies hat for a second here. This is a small lecture that I'm about to deliver. I do think that those qualities, though, the immersion, the multimodality, and the somewhat finiteness thing, are things that align with tabletop. Again, that last category, that's probably the most divergent. But for the first one, in terms of immersion, I like the terms that the theorists Bolter and Grusin put out, where they talk about immediacy and hypermediacy of a form. So the tendency for a medium to conceal its nature as one or to reveal it. Something like a film has high immediacy because it tries to create a direct illusion of reality, whereas something like a website is hypermediated because you see the boundaries of the window, there are hyperlinks or pop ups, you have other windows open, like all those things that remind you you are using this artificial thing. So, with tabletop RPGs, I think of them as tending more towards the former and video games towards the latter. And it's the difference between a kind of psychological immersion versus an activity based immersion. So, as you're clicking things, mashing buttons, or whatever in a video game, you are being immersed, but it's a different kind of engagement than when you're kind of like in your character during a role playing session. But obviously, games vary widely, and either category, there are exceptions that we could point to. With multimodality, that connects to it. So that kind of refers to the multiple channels along which these media operate. In a garden variety tabletop game, you're alternating between narration, acting, rolling dice, marking things on sheets, and so on, doing those kinds of activities. In a video game, you might be switching between first person mode, cutscene, game menu, these different kinds of perspectives. And both of them, they mix like the visual and the auditory and the haptic, that feeling you get from hefting dice or holding a controller. So engaging multiple senses at once as you kind of go through the different affordances of the game. And then the finiteness, the indefiniteness, whatever we want to call it, in a character driven tabletop game like Changeling or the World of Darkness series, in theory, you could see your character going on forever, depending on how you approach role playing and how you build it. With video games, I have in my notes here, lines of code tend to run out before imagination, which I think is pointing to what you were saying before. On the other hand, you could say tabletop games tend to fall apart because of scheduling before you can actually get very far. So that's another kind of finiteness. But yeah, I enjoy video games that don't have a defined endpoint and that are open worlds that you can explore. And now we see more and more, especially in like indie small role playing games, they have a defined start and finish that you can run as a one shot in an afternoon. So, there are these parallels, but also these things that kind of break out of them. Obviously, the parallels work best with games that tell stories, probably preferably in a linear fashion. You can kind of see the most connective tissue between them. But I like digging into these mechanics of the media themselves because finding alignment in those structures makes it easier to see how you can port ideas from one to the other. I would say I think video games have taken more from tabletop than the other way around, but I like thinking about options for porting things from video games into tabletop. Like, why not have save points in your World of Darkness game beyond the usual one you have at the end of each game session? Could you introduce cheat codes as a story hook that kind of mess with NPCs or unlock strange powers? What if you swap out a character between sessions? You'd probably have to do either a lot of fourth wall breaking or some kind of convoluted storytelling logic, but that's the kind of shifts of experience that I think would be interesting to explore.
So I think it's worth noting that a lot of tabletop RPGs that are not World of Darkness do a lot of those things.
Yeah, oh, for sure. One of my favorite things in the Trinity system is the dramatic editing system. It's just like, no, we're going to just kind of change this to make this game session a little more interesting. I can get behind that. But yeah, that's my media studies TED Talk for the day. So before we launch into our list of 10 actual games that has been cobbled together, what are or historically have been your preferences as a gamer?
Well, when I was younger and had more free time, I loved those 100, 200-hour RPGs. Now, because I can't guarantee that I'm going to have 60 hours to play through a game in a week or two, I tend to favor strategy games a lot more, where if I put it down for a couple of weeks, I can pick it up, look at the state of the game, and then figure out what I was doing from there.
Right on.
How about you?
I was going to ask if you had any specific ones to recommend.
Strategy games?
For me, yes, because I like strategy games. But
And so, despite the many difficulties I have with how they've managed the World of Darkness, I tend to like Paradox's strategy games.
Gasp. Yeah. I don't know enough about them, honestly. Like, I've seen the names float around, but
They're big, they're complicated. Doing really well tends to require that you understand spreadsheets, because you have to figure out like how the relative merits of economies of like 100 different countries in order to make your plans.
oh my god, it sounds amazing.
They're generally historical simulators where you take control of a relevant power block, whether it's a noble family in Crusader Kings or a nation in Victoria. And you are in charge through some historical period. Like for Crusader Kings, you're running a noble family from usually about the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, to where you can kind of see the Renaissance in the not too distant future.
All right.
And Victoria is industrialize or die.
Oh no.
It's even funny because if history has made sure that each game kind of has a final boss, so of course Victoria's final boss is England.
Natch.
If you can industrialize harder than England, you win, morally speaking.
I'll give it a try at some point, but I mean, I have probably the game that I've logged the most hours in my life is Civilization 2. So that's like my gold standard.
Yeah,
SimCity 2000 comes close, but
I grew up on Civilization 2. I have followed the franchise.
Yep.
And I kind of fell off of it when I hit the Paradox Grand Strategy games.
All right. I've stuck with it. I haven't really gotten into 6, but I'm very eager for 7. But also, like, party-based dungeon adventures I grew up with. My siblings and I used to play Bard's Tale for, like, hours every Saturday morning, because that was just what we did. And similar to what you're saying about being able to step away and come back, I like browser-based solo games with limited multiplayer interaction, mostly because I've never kept any kind of, like, consistent gaming schedule. I go through phases, and I don't really like engaging with strangers on the internet too much.
Yeah, I've never been one for MMOs. Just
MMOs and shooters, and
between subscription fees and trying to play with large numbers of strangers who are often, let's be completely blunt here, 12.
I was going to say assholes, but the two are not mutually exclusive.
I know that when I was 12, I was, so.
As we all were. People keep trying to get me to try Minecraft, but if I did, I think no one would ever see me again, so I've steered clear of it. But
I'm from the other direction. I played Dwarf Fortress before I ever heard of Minecraft, and then people said, oh, Minecraft is just like Dwarf Fortress. I looked at it like, okay, it's like Dwarf Fortress for 12-year-olds.
Oh, all right.
And again, I endeavor not to interact with 12-year-olds on the internet.
It's probably a wise approach in general. Anyway, shall we talk about I was about to say the canonical 10, but it's not really canonical in any way. It's just the 10 we're going to talk about.
Yep, I believe you're up first.
I am. Alphabetical order for the win. So the first one is maybe a little bit obvious, and it's American McGee's Alice, a landmark game of yesteryear from way back in 2000, I want to say. And it is actually, despite all my saying I don't really care for like first-person action-based stuff, it is a little bit more of that than I usually go for. You actually have things to fight and defeat. As the name suggests, it's adapted from Alice in Wonderland, but in this instance, Wonderland was this dream world of Alice's, which she woke from to find her house burning down, resulting in her parents' death, and then she was burned and scarred and became catatonic and was institutionalized. So the game kicks off where she's in this institution in Victorian England, and Wonderland's inhabitants start calling out to her for help. Theoretically, it's all taking place in her mind. You have a sanity meter instead of a health track. It's all very creepy. It's a very gothic aesthetic and very occult tinged. There's like the bloody toothed Cheshire cat following you around, and the various inhabitants of Wonderland are recast as often misshapen monstrosities. So there's a lot of things to borrow for Changeling. Three things in particular, though, that I want to call out. I mean, first, that aesthetic itself is a reminder of how you can take these traditional or popular beloved stories and twist them, kind of that return to the macabre origins of fairy tales vibe. And it gets a little bit postmodern in that kind of approach that it takes. We spoke on another episode about doing horror in Changeling, and I think that I opined on that one that part of what Changeling does best is psychological horror, which in and of itself has lots of divisions. And by showing the kind of dark mirror of these whimsical fantasy worlds, it produces this uncanny feeling, I would say, for the player as much as the character. And so leaning into that is something which I think Changeling can do well, which Alice does well as a game, because it is this very familiar cast of characters, and to kind of see them presented this way is eerie in a deep way. So that's one thing. Second, there are so many weapons and objects through the game, the Vorpal Blade being like the primary weapon that could be repurposed into treasures. There's so many inventive creatures that you could repurpose as Chimera. So just kind of giving that World of Darkness flavor to beloved whimsical fantasy texts. Make them nightmarish. That's the takeaway. And then there are sections of the game. I remember one in particular. I think it's when you're fighting the chess pieces, and you kind of have to move along this chessboard, and it constrains your movement. You have to move like a bishop or something, so you can only move on the diagonals. So with Changeling, why not introduce those kinds of rules in Dreaming Realms that the characters come across? Add these additional mechanics to make them feel distinctive, and especially as you go from zone to zone, players have to kind of figure out the rules each time. That kind of uncertainty, I think, would keep players on their toes in an interesting way. It's been a while since I played it, I admit, but a lot of those kinds of ideas about what a game could be were planted deep in my adolescent psyche by it. So I still really admire it. I have a large poster on my bedroom door as like an apotropaic symbol. Cheshire Cat will keep all the baddies away. And you've tried it out, is that correct?
Yeah, I was really into it for a little bit, but I couldn't finish it because some of the jumping puzzles were just giving me the worst vertigo.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. It's like there was a little bit too much action-oriented stuff for me to be like really into it, but
jumping over bottomless holes with like weird swirling things underneath them and such
oh yeah.
just hit just wrong for how my brain works, and I just could not keep going.
But as a concept, that thing you just said is absolutely something I would drop into a dreaming scene. Like, okay, roll Dex plus Athletics to hop over this bottomless pit with a swirling thing at the bottom, and you don't want to find out what that swirling thing is.
It is
So,
unfortunately a swirling pool of expired chocolate.
oh no.
The worst possible thing to fall into.
The hell of expired chocolate. So then next up, we have Braid.
So Braid is a 2D platformer where, well, the world is very saturated with 2D platformers. In order to stand out, you need a good gimmick, and Braid stood out.
Yep.
So the gimmick of Braid is that the entire game runs on time manipulation mechanics. There's the world where when you move to the right, time advances forward. When you move to the left, time retreats backwards. Instead of dying, you pause and rewind to get back to where you were right before you got killed by the enemy or fell into a pit or whatever. There's puzzles that can only be solved by stopping time, and stopping time for everything except for the one thing on the screen that is immune to stop time, and it has to go through and do something while you wait. One of the secrets in the game requires that you stand still for 8 hours. The game has very funky time vibes, great for ideas for how to use time in odd ways, either to mess with the players or to really mess with NPCs.
Yeah.
And on top of that, It has a plot that can inspire some ideas for tabletop RPGs too, where it starts out and you're a guy trying to rescue the princess from a castle.
Classic.
Pretty bog standard Mario clone. But the cracks in the story start showing as you go forward until the final level where you play through it, and then the level plays backwards and you see what actually was happening throughout the entire game.
This is maybe a good point to ask, how spoilery should we get, do you think?
Well, I can leave it there and the only other thing I'll say is that if you've seen people on the internet randomly say that something is a metaphor for the atomic bomb, it's got Braid to thank for that.
There you go. I was going to say it has more to do with the horror of the glamour of science than it appears to at first glance.
Yeah, there's that. There's also questioning your identity and whether the stories you tell yourself about who you are true. And what could be more Changeling than that?
Yeah. Isn't there also there's like a level where you throw a ring and it slows time around it or something? I'm trying to remember like all that. There's a treasure right there.
If you are interested in actually really cool ideas for magic that manipulates time, items that mess with time, or just weird time environments and so on, either play through the game, it's actually not that long, or watch a Let's Play on YouTube if you're just not a platformer person. It really pays off in dividends for, messing with time. Like, no other game I've ever seen has messed with time as well as Braid.
Yeah. People point to Prince of Persia and I'm like, psh, small potatoes. But it also just, I mean, it's a very lovely game too. I sometimes just put the soundtrack on. Like,
just... Oh, the game is very pretty. Like, and it's like 2D sprite graphics, which have mostly fallen out of fashion in a lot of gaming circles, but it's a very good looking game. It sounds great.
Yeah.
Even if you're not really a platformer person, I'm not really a platformer person, I do recommend trying to play the game. It's a really good game.
And it's good that, I mean, even if you're not really a platformer, I would say most people at least know what Mario Brothers looks like and how it operates. And like it very much at the start, at least, has that kind of mechanical vibe to it. Like you're running around, you're jumping, you're hopping on top of monsters to kill them. Like it's intuitive.
Yeah. And everything that goes further, as it goes further and further away from just being a Mario clone, it introduces things very gradually.
Mm-hmm.
It's also a very good lesson in how to get buy-in for weird stuff by starting from stuff that's familiar, which is an important technique for storytellers.
So maybe on the opposite end of the spectrum in terms of simplicity and complexity, we next have kind of a placeholder for any game in this subgenre, but Final Fantasy, the insert number here, whichever one you prefer.
So Final Fantasy is an institution. It's hard to really say anything else about it as a video game alone. It's just they've been going since 1988, and there are several that are good.
Several, but not all.
I admit that I'm not a huge fan of the more recent games, as it has kind of gone more first-person action RPG rather than the old party-based, turn-based. I'm one of the people who just loves having the, what was it, like 30 characters in the cast of Final Fantasy VI?
Each one doing like 600 damage a pop.
Well, you took 5 of them with you whenever you were doing anything, but you got to pick your party for most stuff, and that was really fun. Whereas in, Final Fantasy 16, I think is the most recent one. Yeah, you're this guy. Sometimes you have a friend. It's just a very different experience, and not what I go for Final Fantasy for. But anyway, bringing it around to Changeling, you can get lots of inspiration for just general fantasy things. You've got your giant rideable birds. You've got even the more recent ones that I'm not as big a fan of. They've got some really stunning and unique landscapes going on. And the most important lesson from Final Fantasy VI is always include an opera scene.
Ah, I can get into that. That's the thing, too, is that it's gotten more and more involved in the story of its characters over time. Like, in the initial ones, they were just, like, Red Mage or whatever.
Yeah.
So...
Well, Final Fantasy 1, the characters didn't even have even something pointing at names. They just had their jobs, and you got to name them. As they went, the characters started having personalities and plot threads, and I'm going to show my age, but to me the series really kind of peaked in the 4, 5, 6 era on the Super Nintendo, where you simultaneously had relatively large casts of characters, but each character had enough depth that you could become emotionally attached to them.
And the music for those are infamously good.
Oh, yeah. I keep an old Nintendo 3DS around just for the Final Fantasy Theater Rhythm game to play a rhythm game with the old Final Fantasy music.
Nice. There's an album that somewhere out there, but it's like Nobuo Uematsu's works done just like solo piano, and it's like the whole Final Fantasy soundtrack. Beautiful.
Yeah, there's some good stuff like that. If you really want a fun study in contrast, like listen to a song from Final Fantasy 4 or 6.
Mm-hmm.
5's music wasn't quite at the same level as those two. It was good, but it wasn't 4 and 6. 2 and 3 in America. And then every single piece of music in Final Fantasy has been performed by a full symphony orchestra at some point. Find it and listen to it, and generally speaking, that is what was going through Uematsu's head. And it's also interesting hearing how he translated that mental sound into chiptunes.
He's a genius.
Yeah. I fell for a Kickstarter scam entirely because Uematsu's name was attached to it.
Oh no.
He got screwed too, but...
Oh no. Well,
I'll tell you about it some other time.
Yeah, that'll be the cut material. But it's also just, I mean, as another kind of thought on the genre, moving away from Final Fantasy in particular, what's your thoughts on the tendency of video game role-playing games? I feel like they've done more and more attention to world building as time has gone on, partially because now that games have more memory and more space to work with, they can. But
yeah, you see a jump in depth between the 8-bit and the 16-bit era.
Yeah,
NES to Super Nintendo. And then again between the Super Nintendo and I'm just going to call them modern systems, because once the PlayStation hit and you could swap discs, there was no longer the limits that they used to have, except for on graphics.
Yeah.
I don't really think that the setting is any deeper for Final Fantasy 16 than it is for 7. And I'm willing to argue that 4, 5, and 6 hit the same level, partly because being sprite-based, they're spending less of their energy on graphics.
Fair enough.
But more generally, the fantasy RPG genre of video games, and especially fantasy role-playing like Dungeons & Dragons, a lot of people see it as being kind of a one-way video games trying to emulate tabletop. But I definitely think that there's more of a feedback cycle there. Like, if you look at early editions of D&D, you can kind of see when video games happened, because the game shifts a little bit.
Yeah.
It starts focusing more on the narrative and on the freedom that the characters have, rather than just being a tactical combat simulator.
Yeah.
Even if the mechanics aren't changing as much, the story that the game tells about what it is changes a little. Because as a tactical combat simulator, nothing that happens on your tabletop is going to really compete in terms of energy of a video game, where all of the math is being done by a computer, all the randomness is being hidden from you, and you just get to go and choose an action and see how it lands immediately with no effort whatsoever. Video game combat just really makes clear how slow and miserable World of Darkness combat often is.
It's true, but I think we realize that even without video games.
Oh, yeah. But like even Dungeons and Dragons, which is a combat simulator at its heart,
takes forever.
Doesn't hold a candle to a well-built computer game when it comes to just getting across the energy, the feel of how like frantic and frenetic a battle should be.
Yeah. And that points back to that two different kinds of immersion again, where because the combat is unfolding so quickly, and often, at least nowadays, with flashy graphics, you can get very invested in this rapid sequence of events happening in front of you. Whereas tabletop, you have the ability to kind of get slow, And I think it's difficult to do that in a video game. I think when they do a cutscene, it's almost like artificially trying to get you to immerse into it, but because you have no agency in that cutscene, it's like, ugh. I've heard that Baldur's Gate 3 kind of threads the needle really well, but I haven't tried it yet, so.
Yeah, Baldur's Gate 3 is on that I don't have time for this, but I really would like to category.
Someday.
Yeah, like in a D&D video game, you are unlikely to be able to just scoop up some sand from the arena floor and throw it in your enemy's eyes. In D&D, you can, no problem.
And should.
That's kind of the difference. The computer can go fast, but the game master can react to the weird things you want to try.
Yeah. So the next one, this is one of my favorites, so I'm going to have to stop myself from waxing poetic, but this is Kingdom of Loathing. And for everything that we're saying about video game RPGs and the worlds that they sort of sketch out, Kingdom of Loathing's entire purpose is to be a parody of them, of the entire genre. The classes are things like Pastamancer and Disco Bandit. You have powers based on elements like fire and cold, but also stench and sleaze. The currency in the universe is meat. The graphic art is all stick figure based. The sort of big bad that you fight is the naughty sorceress. And when you fight her and she enters her final form, I just remember one of my favorite pieces of writing in like any game is that it's described as being accompanied by a sound like the unzipping of the fly of God Almighty, which I don't know why, that just sticks in my brain. But it's endless good fun. It's completely irreverent and tongue in cheek. It's browser based with a set number of turns you get per day. But then you go through quests and you level up. And if you defeat the naughty sorceress, you can then ascend and restart. But each time you restart the game, you get to carry over one power from your previous incarnation. So it's like eventually you're kind of multi-classing because you've retained whatever skills from one class that you want to bring into the next one, and you get to keep all of your items and everything. So you become like, you start going through the quests faster and faster and picking up more and more powerful loot. There are guilds, there's a whole community that's been going for more than 20 years at this point. I used to spend an inordinate amount of time on it every day. So I do miss it sometimes, but I also feel that I've maybe been doing more productive things with my life since I stopped playing it. But for mood alone, I really appreciate it because I like to bring that irreverence into my games. It's kind of like if Terry Pratchett decided to make a browser game about role playing games instead of a novel series about all the other fantasy tropes. That's kind of the feel that it conveys. So the quests are kind of like goofy, but the structure is serious. And that line between the two is something that I think can easily be brought into Changeling. With reincarnation, I would love there to be a more robust system for that in Changeling, which Kingdom of Loathing does provide. I'm sure other folks have like homebrewed something along these lines for Changeling, but if I were to put together formal mechanics for it, I would do it like this. Probably in parallel with the sort of setting and metaphysical questions of Changeling reincarnation. Maybe in one of the upcoming Changeling 30th anniversary projects. So yeah, I don't know, it's relaxing, particularly if you're playing something like Final Fantasy at the same time, to go through this like, maybe it varies by game, but I think of Final Fantasy as taking itself way too seriously sometimes. And then to kind of transition over to this where it's like you're in a zone where all of the monsters have palindromic names, so now you're fighting a taco cat, things like that.
Yeah, the way too seriously thing is very much a modern Final Fantasy thing.
I believe that. It was like 7 when everyone was like, oh, she died and it's so sad, the
Yes, that
protagonist's love interest.
pet peeve is people who think that, her dying in Final Fantasy VII was the first major character death in Final Fantasy, and screw you all. Final Fantasy IV, I am still not recovered from the ones in that one.
Was it 4 or 2?
Yes.
Oh no.
It was 4 in Japan and 2 here, and now because 2 and 3 finally got translated at some point, it's 4 here also.
Okay. The
So
universe
it's
has
2 on the
aligned.
Super Nintendo in the US, and it's 4 on Steam.
This is like trying to hash out which edition of Hunter we're on.
What order did the Zelda games come in?
Oh, Zelda. We didn't even talk about Zelda could also I know next to nothing about Zelda.
I was just tossing out a gamer controversy.
All right. Let's see what's next. This is one of yours.
Yeah, so on to games that have a very definitive ordering.
Yay!
Unlike Zelda, the Persona franchise. So Persona is a spin-off franchise of the larger Shin Megami Tensei franchise, which you could characterize as, what if Pokemon was for grown-ups and you could make Thor and Zeus fight each other?
Perfect.
Except it came out like a decade before Pokemon.
Even better.
So the Persona franchise, instead of being about people who capture a bunch of demons and fight each other, is about people who have demons attached to them who are in some way their true selves, and then they fight each other.
All right.
It's still a computer RPG, so console RPG, whatever. Consoles are computers, deal with it.
Yeah.
So Personas 1 and 2 tend to be forgotten because they don't really fit the vibe that the franchise has developed since then, with 3, 4, and the much more wildly popular 5. The basic idea of all of them is that you're some guy in high school, so we're already in a horror game, and one thing leads to another. You're taken to a mysterious room where your power is awakened, that you can use more than one persona. So you can use Zeus or Thor, whereas all your friends are restricted to just one, which is in some way representative of their true selves. But you, being the player character, are a much more fluid target for as far as identity is concerned. Though there is generally a canonical, here's the first one you start with, and eventually it, in some sense, evolves into the last one that is involved in the cutscenes at the end of the game.
Okay.
And each of these 3 games has a very different theme, taking on some aspect of Japanese society that is really messed up. In reverse order, because we're mostly going to talk about 3. 5 is about how endemic abuse of authority is in Japan. 4 is about the way that media is used to manipulate the people of Japan. And 3 is about suicide.
Oh boy.
All the triggers.
Content warnings.
The opening theme is even named Memento Mori.
Well, when you say in Japan, would you say that each of those aspects, I think I would say, each of those has a particular cultural inflection to it? But would you say that that still translates across cultures?
Yes, though it's Persona 5's authorities abuse their power, clearly translated the best of the 3, being wildly the most popular of the 3 games.
Obviously, you have a lot more experience with Japanese culture than I do, but my sense would be that if you spoke to a Japanese gamer and you spoke to an American gamer and asked them to describe what does it mean for an authority to abuse their power, you'd get much different answers.
One of the major bosses is a politician who is using their power to cover up sexual assault.
All right, that's something everyone can get.
You're not getting
get behind, but
you're not actually getting hugely different answers for most of the antagonists here in that one.
Okay, all right.
Whereas Persona 3 came out really kind of towards the peak of Japan's specific suicide crisis.
So can you say more about Persona 3 then, and why you think that one may be a better analog for Changeling than 4 or 5?
So there was a lot of discussion of this in the Discord server, and I actually disagree with it to a certain extent. I think that all 3 of them are extremely good sources of Changeling, and I'm not sure I would say 3 is the best one. To put it in more directly Changeling terms, honestly, the entire World of Darkness is kind of about older, powerful people abusing their power and the player characters trying to, stop them in some way.
Yeah.
That's not unique to Changeling. That is what Persona 5 is about. Persona 5 even goes so far as to, in order to cast magic spells, you pull off your mask, which may or may not include part of your face. It's up to interpretation from the graphics. But you reveal your true self, and then you can do magic, which I can't think of anywhere in Changeling where revealing your true self lets you do magic. Just not a thing, right?
No, I don't think it's anywhere in the core books.
Meanwhile, Persona 4 is all about challenging narratives about yourself. This is a recurring theme in the video games that really work here, where there's a lot of attention paid to narrative. Characters have to come to terms with who they are while also rejecting what society is saying that they are.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. With 3, there's more of a single narrative of everything is about to end, and by kind of leaning in certain ways to the story of the main character's persona, they are able to prevent the world ending, but at a terrible cost. And it is relevant that their persona is Orpheus.
Huh. Oh my.
Again, everything in Persona 3 is about death. I honestly would probably actually mark Persona 4 as the most Changeling one because how much it centers around media narratives. But you can pull a lot from all 3 of them.
Yeah, I could certainly... But I also feel like I can make them work for the other World of Darkness games as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure which World of Darkness game I would say 3 resonates with the most because it hits different ones in different ways. 4, I would actually say, is Changeling first because, again, that emphasis on, the characters are the stories about themselves. Sadly, and this is from the perspective of all 3 of them are very good games, 4 is the weakest of the 3 games.
Oh
But
no.
that's, the weakest of three very good games.
Yeah.
3 is the most tonally coherent and the most, I have come here to do something and I am going to do that incredibly strongly. The gameplay in 5 is just really, really good, and strong plot, strong characters. Like, there's a reason that it's kind of the breakout that really has brought the other two to the forefront in larger communities.
Hmm.
4 has some places where it's rough around the edges. It's very self-conscious about trying to deal with some queer themes.
Hmm.
And you have to keep in mind it is doing so from a Japanese early to mid 2000s perspective. So it's not going to sound great in 2024 America.
Yeah. But, good on them for making the effort.
Yeah, like two of the characters, one of them is a gay male teenager who is overcompensating for that in the awkward way you kind of expect from early 2000s media. And another one is. Actually, I'm not going to say what the other one is because if you haven't played it yet, there's spoilers involved.
Noted.
It is not a secret that the other character is gay. It is the most obvious thing in the world from pretty much his introduction. And some stereotypes appear. Just fair warning.
I can imagine. I have some
Uh,
sense.
Persona 4 was released in 2008 in Japan, and Japan has a very different everything about non-cis, non-straight things than the US does.
Yeah. I wanted to glom onto your comment about the worst of the three and segue and say, speaking of other terrible games, which is maybe shots fired or showing my bias or whatever, but the next one on the list is Pokemon Go. And I'll admit that I'm biased against this game because it directly contributed to the end of a relationship for me, which I
Oof.
won't get into, but it probably doesn't even need an introduction. For anyone who missed the craze, this is the game that I would say brought the idea of, in heavy quotes, augmented reality as a concept to the masses in a big way. You play it on your smartphone, you walk around, you point your smartphone camera at things, and Pokemon appear on the screen, which you can then fight and capture as in the usual game. Geolocation is a factor as different types of Pokemon appear in different parts of the world, and they're more or less concentrated in different places. I don't know like what the algorithm is. So I would say, talking about media again for a second, even if it did bring people together who might otherwise be gaming alone, which defenders of the game often pointed to, like, look, it's getting gamers to socialize. I still found it a little bit weird that those interactions were happening primarily through the phones while being physically present together. But all of that doesn't mean I can't still see some inspirations for Changeling. And this is an example of how you might explain, especially to new players, what it's like to encounter Chimera or the chimerical world overlaid onto the real one. Because when you play the game, you still see everything real that's there in the background. Real, again, in heavy quotes, just with like these little bouncing graphics on top of it. So it's a simplistic kind of analogy, but it helps people understand. I mean, I have actually used Pokemon Go to explain that concept in Changeling to people. And I'm sure there are other games at this point, certainly, that could probably get the same idea across with that technology in a better way. But, it's been my go to for a while. Thematically, also, Chimera Hunt is a reasonable enough story arc, so you could use this as an introduction to the game in a story arc sense as well. So yeah, I don't know if you.
Cell phone that you point at and you can see chimerical reality through the camera sounds like a really cool treasure to give to an ally.
I'm sure that it's somewhere on a homebrew site somewhere. So yeah, but I find it at the same time also kind of an expression of banality, like reducing the possibilities of what that world could be to here's this little bouncing graphic that you have to go around and capture. Now go and capture another one, and your self worth is entirely tied to how many you've caught. I find that maybe offends me less when it's contained within the world of Pokemon, the game, but then extending it to your own interactions like with the world around you as you are moving through it. It's helpful to articulate that aspect of Changeling, but I do kind of find it awful. I don't know. I
Yeah,
have
like
strong feelings.
I would say that my biggest objections to Pokemon Go were that it was not a good Pokemon simulator.
That also is fair.
Like, it didn't play anything like the Pokemon games that it's supposedly based on. extremely limited in many ways, partly by just the technology when it came out.
Yeah.
It took them, 2 years to add trainer versus trainer battles? It was a Pokemon game where you couldn't gather a bunch of Pokemon, find a friend, and say, hey, let's fight.
Yeah.
And, why?
So it was very solo.
Yeah, it was ironically very solo, considering that that people were lauding it as this social thing.
Yeah. Well, the next game on the list is Psychonauts, and I think of psychonautics in an occult sense as being a very solo activity, but I know very little about the video game. So I don't know if you have any.
It is a single-player game.
All right, on the nose.
So Psychonauts is another platformer, ironically, considering that I generally don't like platformers. It is also another one with lots of jumping around over infinite voids, but for whatever reason, this one didn't trigger that vertigo. I can't deal with this like Alice did. So the premise is that you're this kid, you got psychic powers, and you go to psychic summer camp, and then everything goes horribly, horribly wrong. And then you have to basically break into the brains of all of the people around you to fix their problems so that you can stop the villain. This game is a wealth of dream realms. The one that I found most memorable was the Milkman Conspiracy, where you are in the head of a conspiracy theorist. So there's constantly figures watching you, suspicious characters around every corner. The landscape twists into this kind of still almost wholesome looking nightmare version of Suburbia. Just very fun level.
So it's like each brain you go into is a separate dreaming realm almost.
Yeah, it's exactly like that.
Huh.
Like when you go through the gym teacher who was ex-military, you are in a war zone.
I mean, it sounds like fabulous Childling inspiration, at least.
It's there's so much you can pull from Psychonauts, and it even has a sequel, Psychonauts 2, which I have not played, but I recommend because everyone I know who's played it says it's up there with the original, but I just haven't had the time.
All right.
Yeah, lots of dream realms, as you said, Childling. Although the main character, despite being, I don't know, 9, 10 maybe, I don't actually know how old these characters are. The art is very stylized, so you can't even go by just looking at them. The character definitely has a bit more of a wilder, possibly even grump vibe at times. He's certainly grumpy, but then again, his summer camp got ruined.
I mean, that's the kind of thing when we talk about seeming being uncoupled from age, and now it's like, oh, well, a Childling could be any age, a Wilder could be any age. I like the idea of a 10-year-old grump kind of going around and solving these problems for that reason. I want to get back to my macrame or whatever. And just that's the motivation. It's not necessarily just the adventure of it or the drive to solve problems.
I was learning how to light things on fire with my mind. Can we get back to that, please?
There you go.
I have things to burn.
Yeah. On the subject of child protagonists, the next one, I confess I haven't actually played this, but I sat and watched it being played for hours and felt very inspired by it. But this is Tandem, A Tale of Shadows. It's kind of derivative of the game Contrast, so talking about both a little bit. Both of them share a mechanic of solving puzzles by manipulating light. So the protagonist is able to move around spaces that are illuminated, and their companion is able to affect things in areas shrouded by darkness. So these puzzles that require pulling levers and whatnot, you kind of have to do in both areas and adjust the lighting level so that your companion can go where you can't and get through to the next set of challenges. Contrast is more inspired by noir and Art Nouveau. Your protagonist is the child of a nightclub singer and a would-be circus owner, and you have an imaginary friend assisting you who can jump between shadows. Tandem is more steampunk Victorian. You're searching for the missing son of an illusionist couple, and your companion is an ambulatory teddy bear who can walk on walls. So aesthetically, I think both of them are great inspirations. But they also point to, I think, great ways to integrate chimerical companions into the game. I actually don't see as many players as I feel like I should taking that background, but I suspect that some number of those who do treat their companion as just an accessory or a boost to what they can already do, rather than complementing their skill set with something different, even if it's just for a limited number of cases. Maybe your chimerical companion has that one power which is not going to be useful all the time, but it's something you absolutely cannot do on your own. So you really need them in certain cases. So I like that aspect of it. I gravitate towards stories that involve puzzle solving and precision. So as a storyteller, I would happily design around the shared capabilities of a character in my game and their chimera, especially if the player isn't aware of it. So like you present a puzzle to the players, they can't necessarily figure out how they can surmount that situation until it occurs to them that if they do one thing and their companion does another, that will get them through to the next stage or whatever. And maybe the whole game doesn't need to be structured around that in the same way that this video game is. But I feel like if a player puts dots into that trait, you might as well at least do one or two story arcs that are along those lines. And I mean, there are plenty of games where there's that kind of dynamic. Something else that didn't make the short list was Portal, and the idea of having like the companion cube that you can like throw around. That's a chimerical companion. So yeah, I don't know if there are other games. I don't know if I want to call that a genre necessarily, but having Tails run around behind Sonic maybe is at the root of that. Anyway, I actually have two in a row then because the
Yep.
next one is also mine, and this is Untitled Goose Game. So this might be a catch-all for any game where you play an animal, but few of them have the irreverent glory of this one, which, as the name suggests, you play a goose. And your entire purpose is to just mess up an entire village of humans as you complete tasks. Like I said, I've got a weakness for the puzzle solving stuff. But what I really love about this one is that there's no text, there's no, speech based interaction. It's all just kind of stuff you have to intuit that you're going to do. Like, get this object, to throw it in this well, to get this person to leave their workbench so you can steal this wrench, so you can go, undo the bolts on this thing. Like, it's a little bit like Myst, another one of my all-time favorites, but with feathers and a complete disregard for personal property. Straight up an unseelie Pooka game that I want to run.
But see, I was just thinking more broadly that Entitled Goose Game is a great way for storytellers to remember what it's like to be a player.
Oh, I like that too. Yeah, because there isn't, I mean, very little is spelled out for you, if anything. Like, you know what you have to do,
Oh,
but
you're being more generous than I was. I was just thinking in terms of you're there to ruin everyone's day.
yeah. But like, there is a purpose to it. You don't necessarily have to follow it and do it. You can have just as much fun messing with people. When I see the gifs and the memes and stuff, that's what people are focusing on. It's not like no one cares about a walkthrough of Untitled Goose Game. It's just how can you mess up somebody's day? But we don't really get much about like puka animal forms and what to do with them in the game, except that you can kind of cobble together combat stuff, or maybe like, okay, now you can fly or get into tiny spaces, so maybe that'll help you with spying or something. But I would love to run a game for a player who wants to stay in animal form the entire time and has just completely mastered the art of getting shit done, monkey wrenching Pentex, becoming the terrorizing overlord of a small town, all of that. It's a style of humor that I think Changeling makes room for that a lot of other World of Darkness games don't. So,
Also, they could just, really mess with some werewolves.
yes, 100%. And it's that merry chaos that I live for. So, yeah, Untitled Goose Game. Check it out. Last but certainly not least is the one that might be the best and deepest connection to Changeling, but I am not an expert on it, and I'm going to let you
Yeah.
talk about this one.
So this game is Yume Nikki. That's Japanese for Dream Diary. And oh, is this a rabbit hole to go down? So we'll start with the fact that though they have a name that's public, no one really knows the person who created it.
Interesting.
Which means that there's no explanations for anything. And that no explanations for anything is actually a big part of why the game has been so successful. And by successful, I mean that really weird people on the internet are super into it. And you should be too.
I mean, from what I saw of the playthrough, I am really into it, but I haven't yet had the time to.
Yeah. So you play as a girl of unclear age named Marotsuki, which translates to next to the window. She is a hikikomori. That's a person who never leaves their room. And you start in the real world, in your room. There's not much to do there except for go to sleep. And then you are in this really surreal, weird dreamscape. And You are certain that there is symbolism everywhere, but you have no idea what it represents.
I love ad hoc symbolism too, so I enjoy that level of mystery. Like this, it means something, but you don't know what.
There's just enough common themes to the beings, the events, the scenery, etc. that you see that you are confident that it all must mean something, but you never get an explanation. The ending leaves at least as many questions as actually not doing the ending would. It leaves more questions. It doesn't answer anything at all, except for what happens at the end of the game, which is the least interesting question after all. It pulls from all sorts of weird places. Like, there's a lot of Japanese folklore there, which is not shocking. It's a Japanese game. There's a lot of Mesoamerican inspiration there, which is kind of surprising because that's not really a sort of symbolism that you see commonly in Japan. There may or may not be things that are symbolic of sex. It's kind of open to interpretation. May or may not be things symbolic of traffic accidents. Again, up to interpretation. Is the character agoraphobic? Maybe, maybe not. But the entire game does scream when you get trapped in a small room.
Interesting.
There is no way to describe this game concisely, except for that it is surreal. The only thing about it that is not very dreamlike is that it is a consistent world that you go into multiple times by going to sleep. Like, nothing in it has changed. So it's less mutable than a real dream, but other than that, it really captures kind of the weird, symbolic nonsense of dreaming. And if you can play this game and not come away with it with ideas for things to do in Changeling, I
You're beyond help.
think that you are probably an autumn person.
Isn't there something too where it's like you change forms, like from?
So you can collect a bunch of, they're generally called effects. They change you in some way. Some of them are simple, like long hair. Some of them are, a bit more complicated, like stoplight. Some of them are just weird, like poop hair.
Oh no.
Which also plays into some of the attempts at explaining the symbolism and doesn't play into others. There's a fairly small number of them that are actually needed to do anything, but you need all of them to complete the game.
Okay.
The one that you use the most throughout the game is the knife, which you use to stab figures in your dream, which definitely doesn't mean something at all.
It does sound like the kind of sort of displacing aspect, like something that I wish was more kind of highlighted in Changeling is, yes, the dreaming feels very familiar because it is the home of the Fae, but you're also half human, and things are getting real weird real fast, and there should be some kind of recognition of that in a Changeling.
Yeah. Playing through this game, even more than watching a Let's Play, and most people are going to watch a Let's Play, but playing through this game, you get hit by that surreality. This is completely alien to anything that a human is prepared to deal with.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again, in the best sorts of ways.
Well, I look forward to trying.
Down to the point where almost nothing in the entire game has an actual canonical name. The names of the characters are all fandom interpretation or based on file names when they dug through the code or something like that, but just nothing has a name in canon except for a couple of things, and why they have names and other things don't is not always clear. Like, you're hearing me say it's not clear a lot because this is one of the least clear games I've ever seen, and it is amazing for it. It is not a very long game. Like, you can probably play through it in a few hours. Like, if you've got a day off and no family obligations or something, you could probably do it in one day.
And when you talk about people kind of trying to suss out what the meanings are or whatever, how does that shake out on the internet? Is it everyone is unified in their shared passion, or people are going 10 rounds over whether this file name is or isn't important?
From what I've seen, and I have not gone into the deeper, darker recesses of game internet since Gamergate happened, and I just don't want to be anywhere near it.
Sensible.
Everyone recognized that they are as much out on a limb with interpretation as everyone else is. So it's just like, yeah, maybe you're right. I have no explanation for those weird drawings in the sewer. I have no explanation for the Aztec rave monkey, but you have no explanation for the hell face. And what's with the second guillotine?
I mean, going through the fandom sounds just as exciting and fun as the game itself.
Yeah, one of the most reasonable ways to experience this game is to watch a Let's Play. You have to see the raw material before you go anywhere else.
All right.
And it has to be someone who is willing to not talk too much, because trying to tell you what they're doing is just feels weird with this game when the game gives you no explanations, getting some like random YouTuber telling you what's going on. And then they need to do some of the weirder things in the game to actually show them off. Like, the single most popular event in the entire game happens 1 out of 64 times that you turn off the lights in a random house. You have to leave the house and re-enter to get another roll.
Interesting.
So you're going to spend like 10 minutes going in and out in order to see this event, and the person doing the Let's Play should do that for you.
If you have a particular one to share, I could include it in the show notes to this episode.
I don't. The Let's Play that I saw when I first heard about this game has a lot of chatter, and it is, again, painfully late 2000s, down to the guy being kind of racist at times. I can't recommend that to anyone.
I'll dig around and see if I can find a more acceptable.
Yeah, I might also try to find one that at least is quiet, that lets the game speak for itself. There's no dialogue in the game. There's almost no text in the game at all. There's just some sound effects, some ambient music, and that's it.
All right.
Well, and screaming.
Oh, that.
Again, the game isn't a horror game per se, but it's also not a horror game.
Well, again, pointing to Changeling as horror, dreams are inherently... There is a horror to dreams in and of themselves, and it's that uncertainty, that uncanniness, and that's the root of horror.
Here's something I can just read to you. It's the creator of the game put out a single-page document that was a Q&A about the game. Just starting with, what kind of game is it? DS? PS2? It's a PC game created with RPG Maker and released for free on the internet. What's the genre? It isn't horror, neither Guro, a warm-hearted game. I want to try playing it, but how do I do it? Do I need to pay? All you need is to download Yumi Nikki's and RPG Maker's 2003 RTP data to play it. Both are free. I can't leave the room. Use the bed to sleep. Where should I go? You can go anywhere. What should I do? You can do anything. If I had to say something, then I'd recommend you collect the effects. Collecting them is more enjoyable than just walking. I can't seem to find them. Keep trying. That's the entire Q&A for the game. The creator's definitely in that benevolent troll category.
Yeah.
Which is appropriate for someone who is dictating dreams.
I can accept benevolent troll if the thing that they're being a benevolent troll about is fascinating and complex and unsettling. I can get behind that.
Yeah, this game also doesn't really require that you know very much about games, other than that you might want to walk around and interact with things.
Yeah.
Like, it is not built for, like, people who have been playing video games for 40 years nonstop and know every in and out of the medium. It's a little RPG Maker game with no combat system in it. But you do occasionally stab things.
Would your advice be, don't try to speedrun it?
Oh no, you don't. You will miss the entire game if you speedrun.
That's the best kind of game, the games that should not be speedrun.
Like, yeah, you could just burn through, collect all the effects, and then go see the ending. But the ending doesn't explain anything, and you've missed all the weird things that need explanations.
All right.
It's a very environmental game.
This is on the top of my list to try, so... We did get a bunch of other suggestions in the Discord, so just very quickly to rattle those off, people suggested Amnesia, or Fear and Hunger, or Scorn, all for their horror potential. Black Book, Crusader Kings 2, or another feudalism sim. Deltarune, which is all in caps, so I feel like I have to say it like that. Disco Elysium, Elden Ring, Folklore, Franbo, Home Safety Hotline, Life is Strange, True Colors, Myth, The Fallen Lords, Naissance E, Seraza and the Lost Demon, Shadowrun, Shin Megami Tensei, which we already kind of touched on in connection with Persona, Stray Gods, and Vampire Bloodlines for showing the World of Darkness. I might dispute that last one, but nevertheless, it's on the list. So all of those, I mean, if we had more time, we could go into all of them, but I think that's probably good to get people started on looking for video game inspirations, I would say. Are there any others that you want to honorably mention?
And that was a pretty solid list. The Crusader King series is, I mentioned that I play Paradox grand strategy games. It's a Paradox grand strategy game about feudalism. If you don't understand how weird and complicated feudalism can be, give it a try. Though the learning curve is gonna be rough. There's a reason people joke about these games that 200 hours in you finish the tutorial.
Yeah. We also had one question from Yabo that was, are there any notable ways that you find video games informing the ways in which you or others play and run Changeling? Pacing, mechanics, themes, etc. I think we covered that question, but I will say that, like, specifically, I don't go looking for video games to inform my tabletop gaming. I'm appreciative when I see the parallels kind of appear, and that's more the approach that I take. I don't think there's anything specifically from a game that's like, oh, I have to use that now in my role playing. It's like I might try one or two things, but I also don't feel like those one or two things are necessarily video game only. I don't know. Do you have anything that was like you saw it in a video game and you thought, I am absolutely going to start bringing that into my tabletops?
I've literally written code for fast combat resolution.
All right, fair. Yes. That you did mention that one. That is absolutely an appropriate system.
But that's just seeing something video games as a whole do better than tabletop in many ways, and saying maybe we should build a hybrid, like an app assisted role playing game, essentially, where a lot these big complicated things that bog games down often just are not a problem.
Yeah, makes sense.
And I can always just set it aside for a moment if the players do something that the app can't handle.
Well, if you work on that, maybe I'll try to come up with some kind of skill tree thing for getting through the abilities. I don't know. That might be interesting to explore.
Yeah, video games let you do things that are way more complicated than tabletop does, just because the computer handles a lot of that cognitive load.
Yeah. Well, I volunteer as tribute, or whatever the kids say. So there remains for me one question to ask, which is, Charles, if people are interested in stuff that you're working on or want to reach out to you on the internet, where are some places where they might be able to find you?
Well, I have a Patreon as Charles M. Siegel. It's been quiet recently because I've been really burned out after working on the Alchemicals book for Exalted 3. So just I have not been able to make myself do any writing for a little while. I am hopefully going to, get back to it in the next couple of weeks.
Excellent.
I have a website, www.telluriumgames.com, which will be hosting a World of Darkness RPG at some point in the near future. Mage first, because I know Mage best. But I may or may not actually already have character creation code for Changeling.
Watch this space.
And of course, I periodically put things on Storyteller's Vault that people seem to sometimes like. Again, mostly for Mage. But I did put up a very short Kith, so,
Yes.
Grab some math elves.
Yes. And links to all of these will be in the show notes to this episode as well. In terms of other things that will be in the show notes, I'm going to try to do our outro stuff without Josh here because Josh has it all memorized, but you can reach out to us at podcast@changelingthepodcast.com if you wish to send an email. We are on both Facebook and YouTube under Changeling the Podcast. Our Patreon is www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. And Mastodon, we're on there at dice.camp/@changelingpod. I can never remember like the structure of the Mastodon, whatever it is, instances, but it's at changelingpod on the dice.camp instance. However, the best place to get in touch with us and hang out with other listeners and other members of our community is on Discord at discord.me/CTP. So all of those links will be provided in the show notes. I don't really have a structure for this kind of outro, so I guess I'll say once again, I'm Pooka.
And I'm not.
Yeah, and thanks once again for joining in. And Oh god, I don't know what to do. I press stop somewhere. I'm gonna press stop and see what happens. Obviously, there are many other video games out there that could be recast through a Changeling lens. Every Fae could make do with a chimerical Yoshi companion, and the headcrabs of Half-Life make for excellent Noknitze. Collecting Chaos Emeralds from a psychedelic rotating dream realm is a storied pastime for any speedster Pooka. And seemingly endless Dance Dance Revolution competitions fueled by bonus stamina and the Chronos art are one way for a satyr to do their Caliphatos death ritual. One thing we must caution against, though, is eating too many of the dross mushrooms that make you larger. Stick to the 1-ups instead. When you've had your fill of reticulating splines, we'd like to invite you to come hang out on our Discord server at www.discord.me/ctp for further discussion of all things Fae and flavorful. You can also support our show by leaving a review on the podcast listening platform of your greatest convenience, or by signing up for our Patreon at www.patreon.com/changelingthepodcast. Join the ranks of our patrons to get a shout-out at the end of each episode like so. Arcane Anarchist, Derek, Dorcadus, Elorus, Eobol, Oreo, Razcaboose, Sanchiger, Sija, Terry Robinson, Tricerabeth, and Victor Torre. Many extra special thanks to thems. As always, thanks for listening, remember to save frequently, and until next time, keep on dreaming.